So while folks are coming in, we have some instructions up on the screen. So please take a moment to update your name to the preferred name you'd like to be called, your pronouns, and where you're located. And because I've heard the horrors of the Zoom bombs, if you have a weird name and we can't see you, we will kick you out eventually. So please, please, please let us know that you're here to participate and do that little homework. If you're having a challenge with that, please hit us up in the chat and we'll help you out. If you're interested in looking at everybody's beautiful faces or hysterical profile pictures, you can set to gallery view, little instructions on that. And then we appreciate you muting yourself, and I have host capabilities and I'm not afraid to mute you, but I like to give you the autonomy to do that first. That is for kind of the clarity of the conversation. And we all have something or someone in our house that will inevitably make a loud noise while we're in this space. And we've got a few folks jumping into the space. Welcome, welcome. We got 34 so far. We'll play a little game while folks are kind of getting in and getting settled. How many of you have been to 2 or more of the unconference sessions? Raise your hands, wave, do your little thumbs up thing. Cool. How many of you, and I'm gonna unshare the screen so that we can kind of see this. So unshare, stop share, here we go. There you all are. How many of you have been to 5 or more of the unconference sessions? Oh, less hands. How many of you have been to 10 or more of the unconference sessions? I see Lisa thinking, okay, there we go. There we go. And Dee's been to 3,000 of them. So Dee, I feel like next year we should have a passport and kind of have little digital badges for folks. There we go, more work. I'll take that on. I'll help you. Assign me to that now. All right, well, we are almost at 10 after, and I'm sure everyone was here just to listen to me talk at you. Oh, hi, Jess Pop, nice to see you again. I do this in real life sessions too. I gotta talk to all my friends, even if we've met for 5 minutes, it's something else. That's how I roll. So I'm gonna throw this screen share up here again. Just real quickly, yep, share that one. Again, please update your name. It looks like folks have done this pretty successfully. Change your preferred name you'd like to be referred to in this space today, your pronouns, where you're located. Again, if you have a funny name with a no background, we're gonna kick you out. Because we want this to be an engaged participatory experience. Select gallery view if that's your preference. We will be doing some screen sharing, but we're also gonna be doing some presenting as well. And please mute yourself as a gentle reminder. We all have noises in our homes that we forget exist. Please, please do that. So we'll get started next. So if you are here for Quiet Violence Overthinking for Anti-Racist ABCDing, you're in the right place. If this is not what you thought you had signed up for, I hope you stay. Your voice is just as valuable to this conversation. So there are 3 of us from Baltimore, Maryland. We'll introduce ourselves in a moment, who've really been thinking a lot about the term anti-racist and doing this work for a long time. In April of 2015, Freddie Gray was murdered by the police. And we've been doing this work in Baltimore City for long before that, but this is kind of a pivotal point in my journey in this experience. And I know for the folks, my team, my wonderful 2 humans that I engage with, we think a lot about this. So, all right, so before we get started, we have some community agreements. In a different universe, we would be doing these together. but we're living in the Zoom. So I've kind of laid them out based on experiences I've had with some of you before and experiences I've had since. Reminding everyone opting into this space is opting into being recorded. We are recording to the cloud right now. So just be cognizant of that. With your shares, we invite you to be honest, authentic, and real, but we also remind you that whatever is said here exists in the internet. So be cognizant of that. Also be cognizant you can be captured in screenshots. We will have some points where we ask, we'd like to take a screenshot of everyone, make a cute face, or make sure that your cat's not on you. And if you want to opt out, we'll give you a little space to click off, and you don't have to be in there. But know that somebody could be taking your picture at any moment. And all the chat activity is shared with hosts, including private chat between attendees. So if you want to complain about how not cute Becky's glasses are, which is a lie because Becky's glasses are super cute, preferably don't do that, but find an alternative way to do that. A few other things, what is said here, what you see here, let it stay here. That's a strange thing to say when I just said this is being recorded, but be mindful of the details and really take the lessons away. This is not a time to say like, I can't believe this racist shit somebody said. It's thinking about how are we applying the learning to how we move forward in life. Keep your beginner's mind. We are all coming at this in really different spaces. Some of us are coming at it from being on the ground doing this work for decades. Some of us are having our eyes open for the first time, and it's all wonderful and amazing, and we're here today to talk about this. So thank you for showing up to this space. Be curious, participate, and listen, and as if you're always wrong. This is not therapy. I think this is kind of challenging in this moment, talking about these things. We have paid professionals to manage that, and none of us, if you are, that's not why you showed up today to conduct free therapy sessions. So please be mindful of that. This is also not a debate stage. I'm trusting you all to kind of have, if we're having dialogue and asking questions, and it's not about making your point the loudest point in the room. And ABCD practices are rooted in Indigenous wisdom and in some cases appropriated and redeployed through the lens of white supremacy. So we'll keep that kind of all in our conversation as we move forward. Oops. So I just want to invite everyone to kind of sit or stand, whatever kind of spot you're in. If you've worked with me in person, you know I really value kind of grounding yourself and your body in this moment. And I want to invite you to kind of find ground. If you're sitting, maybe that's under your rear. If you have parts of your body that are touching the floor, I invite you to close your eyes or kind of stare down your nose, kind of just relax your gaze, take a moment away from the screen because we're going to be doing a lot on the screen. I know you all do a lot on the screen. Take a moment to find your breath. And I invite you to come back. Come on back. Before we get started, I'm going to acknowledge the land that Becky, Katie, and I are sitting on. We are in Baltimore, Maryland, and this is a statement from the University of Maryland, Baltimore. We gather here today on the Turtle Island, the indigenous term for the North American continent. We are convening on the ancestral land of the Piscataway people in Baltimore City. We humbly offer our respects to the elders, past and present citizens of the Cedarville Band of the Pawtascaway-Conway, the Pawtascaway Indian Nation, and the Pawtascaway-Conway Tribe, and the Algonquin peoples. And I encourage all of you to kind of research the indigenous populations on the land that you sit. And I invite you to have this be a part of your practice in gathering folks in space, acknowledging the land. The United States was built on stolen land and stolen labor, and we need to acknowledge that, especially when holding space and community. So overview of our time together. So we've done our land acknowledgement, community agreements, restorative language. We will introduce ourselves. I'm just a talking head conveniently with a label that says just Wyatt, but we'll introduce ourselves as humans. We'll talk about the framework of what we're doing today. Becky Katie will model some storytelling. So we're gonna do a lot of storytelling today. We'll talk about how we diagram these stories out. We will make sure to incorporate a little bit of a biology break. So if you have to get up, stretch, go to the restroom, get a drink, you know, remember that you're still human, not glued to a screen. We'll do small breakouts for story share. So that will be 3 to 5 people per group. We'll kind of then from there split into larger breakouts, and we'll kind of work through some examples of storytelling, and we'll share some tools, and then we'll do some large group takeaway share outs in the chat, and then we'll have kind of a closing, getting grounded in the space before you transition to your next adventure. I want to name, I know I'm one of the biggest culprits of this as somebody who is responsible for a small child in addition to a full-time job. Attending these conferences may be a little tricky or distracting, so just kind of name it when you're in small groups. If you're here to listen, name that you're here to listen. And if you're really able to be fully present, I invite you to be fully present without your 12 other tabs open. And it's hard because we're on the computer, but really try to sink in, especially when we're in smaller groups, to really listen in to what folks have to share and honoring the space as if you were in physical space with others. So this is us. There are 3 of us. I'm Jessica Wyatt. I am a community organizer in Central West Baltimore. I also pay my bills by working full-time at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County, also known as UMBC. I work in the Alumni Engagement Office specifically with students and young alumni, managing the transition from the student to alumni experience. This is my family that I have drawn. I have a wonderful partner, husband, a 2.5-year-old, and myself, and we had to have feet in this picture. I have been in Baltimore for the better part of a decade, and I have worked professionally in the nonprofit and higher ed sphere the entirety of my time, and I've been spending a lot of time in the last 5 years unlearning a lot of the harm I've caused by great intentions, but horrible impact. So I'm really grateful to have this space to kind of do my own work, but do my own work in community with others. So Becky, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and I'm gonna unshare this so you can actually see my wonderful partners here. So Becky, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Becky. So I grew up in Baltimore, and I attended school in Baltimore City. I left to go to university in New York City, and I had a career in the theater before I, gosh darn it, fell in love and decided to leave the theater and create family and be part of the community that suddenly sort of seemed more important to me. Spent a little time in the Midwest before I moved back to the East Coast and back to Baltimore, and then got a master's degree in education before I got pregnant with twins and decided that I needed to sort of be home for a little while, and then was lured back to the arts high school that I attended, and for the last 15 years have been working in that school. I started teaching musical theater in that school, and then ultimately became the director of the Twigs program, which is a program for a nonprofit program within the institution for 700 second through 8th grade students in Baltimore City. That program, the school, is an interesting mix of students from all over Baltimore City, including kids from some of the most challenged socioeconomic neighborhoods in the city to some of the wealthiest areas of the city. The arts program is a program that really encompasses everything from dance, acting, stage production, film, music, to visual arts. So it sort of is a very all-encompassing arts program. And is pretty intense, especially right now with COVID-19. But that's basically what I've been doing with my life, besides trying to be a mom and a wife to teenage twin daughters. Katie, are you ready?
Sure, yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Katie Rouse. I grew up and still live in the suburbs of Baltimore, so just about a 15, 20-minute drive to be into the heart of the city. And I've worked in and around nonprofits in Maryland for the last 15 years, which is most of my professional career. And most of my work has been in constituent-led mental health advocacy groups in a couple of different ways. Based youth development program that is in Baltimore City, where we work with about 100 students from middle school and college. Almost all of the students of the program are young Black people, and the staff are historically overwhelmingly white people. And the sport that we use, which is squash, which is like racquetball, if that's more familiar to you, becomes really a meeting place for people who are kind of in very different communities. Some very wealthy, overwhelmingly white people, because of the history of how our students in Baltimore, friendly on purpose by various policies and practices. As an organization, we the past year have really been interrogating what we're doing and how we're doing it with an anti-racist lens. And this has been a time of great kind of personal reflection and also reflection on the role of health and human services organizations and the power dynamics there when working in community.
Thank you. I'm gonna go back to some screens. Screen two. All right, so to get us started, we're sharing two definitions that you may or may not be familiar with. So Ibram Kendi is a professor, just a fabulous author, and he wrote the book, How to Be Anti-Racist, which I highly recommend. Did I disappear? Sure did. Okay. Am I back now? Affirmative head nods. Excellent. Okay, thank you. Always when I have to do the juicy stuff. All right, so the two definitions I wanted to share. Anti-racist, I'm gonna read them to you, just so it kind of sinks in. To be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups whenever the anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively. The anti-racist sees exactly that, the individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representatives of whole races. To be anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. So keep that in your mind. White supremacy. White supremacy is a racist ideology that is based upon the belief that white people are superior in many ways to people of other races, and therefore white people should be dominant over other races. White supremacy is not just an attitude or way of thinking, it also extends to how systems and institutions are structured to uphold this white dominance. This idea that white supremacy only applies to the so-called bad ones is both incorrect and dangerous, because it reinforces the idea that white supremacy is an ideology that is only upheld by a fringe group of white people. So keep that in mind as we continue this conversation. In today's conversation, we will use restorative language. I encourage you all to use restorative language. We use I statements. We use empathetic listening, restorative questions, and again, the I statements. So speaking from your perspective, asking a lot of questions. What happened? What were you thinking and feeling at the time? And we have some guides to help you as you walk through your storytelling. So again, you're here for quiet violence. So overcoming anti-racist Overcoming Overthinking for we should have had a much more easy to say title. Overcoming Overthinking for Anti-Racist ABCDing. So with the murder of George Floyd, the three of us kind of got together on a phone call after I got the announcement for the unconferenced submissions, and we said we had to do something. And we've been talking about this. The three of us have met in a cohort of folks who are kind of working through asset-based community development. And there's another member of our cohort in this group. Hi, Jess. It's good to see you. I already said that, but it's good to see you again. So there was a group of 12 of us who got together to kind of work through the academic side, what is ABCD, and then also work through the how do we actually do this in community with one another. And through these conversations, we started unpacking our own privilege, the challenges of working in a nonprofit and not in a higher education and education context, and how we, over our histories, had been doing harm when we didn't realize we were causing harm. And so kind of peeling back the layers and using this as an opportunity to learn, and kind of using that ABCD lens to support our unlearning and unpacking, and then repackaging it to better support ourselves in this work, but to also better support the community in this work. So we did all this through sharing stories. Oh my goodness, we did this so out of order. Katie, you're gonna be on in just a moment. So to give you a little bit of context, we live in Baltimore, Maryland. Raise your hand. I know Jess is in Baltimore. Raise your hand. Is anybody else in Baltimore right now? I'm gonna undo this so I can see. All right. Okay. Anyone else in Baltimore? All right, great, great, great. How many of you are familiar with kind of the political landscape of Baltimore, Maryland? And this can be even from like the news telling you it's kind of a mess. Okay, so we've got some folks, so great. So Katie's gonna educate us in about 2 minutes about some of the bizarre history, not bizarre history, the like real history, and then why there's this, on the surface, a bizarre looking image of a butterfly on top of the map of the city. So Katie, I'm gonna turn it over to you. I see that your video is off, but are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you put up the slide so everyone can see?
I sure can.
Fabulous. I'm going to keep my video off in the hope that it helps with the connection. So I think there are three things that are helpful to understand or to know about Baltimore when we talk about dynamics of race and equity and harm in the city. So the first is just to place Maryland, the state of Maryland and Baltimore, in a national context. So we are the southernmost northern state before you get to the capital, Washington, D.C. Like we kind of nestle D.C. on the northern side. And we are south of the Mason-Dixon line, which in the U.S. is generally understood to kind of delineate the north from the south. So during the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s, Maryland was really a place where you had folks who were on all sides of all issues who lived together. So we have some very rural parts of Maryland, which were very sympathetic to Southern secession and the Confederate cause. We had a lot of people who were abolitionists and who were on the side of the Union. And actually, during the Civil War, the Union Army had to come in and declare martial law in order to keep the railroads open so that the Union could move troops through Maryland into the South to fight battles there, and also to essentially to protect the capital. So we are, as a state, we are in a very liminal space, and we have been throughout the history of our nation. Maryland also has a history of religious tolerance that is, I think, remarkable when you look at the other 13 original colonies. So that's the top picture. On the right-hand side is about Baltimore, and you'll see all these words in blocks of neighborhoods. So I once heard Baltimore described as a southern town that thinks it is a northern city. And Baltimore is very much a city of neighborhoods. Neighborhoods have very distinctive kind of characters, and people are very loyal to their neighborhoods. There are often many generations of people who are born and live in their neighborhood, and their children live in their neighborhood. And even from the like folks who live in West Baltimore, and of course this isn't like true 100%, but really don't go to East Baltimore and vice versa. Like even for being a relatively small city in terms of like New York or Chicago or Atlanta or San Francisco, Baltimore ends up being very siloed, and a lot of times that happens along neighborhood lines. At the same time, for all of this, if you look at the lower picture of the three butterflies, so Baltimore has the distinct dishonor of being the first place in the United States that actually codified racial discrimination in housing in law in 1910, invented a racial ordinance which made it illegal for a person, for instance, who was Black to move onto a block that was mostly white people, and illegal for white people to move onto blocks that were mostly Black people. And this started just repeated iterations of trying to codify discrimination in housing. So obviously, like that's just one symptom of a larger it's one symptom of a larger system of racist anti-Black oppression that's throughout every service delivery system in the world. But in Baltimore, what you end up seeing is that there is what's called the white L, and this is out of work from Morgan State University, which is a historically Black college and university located in Baltimore, from a researcher, I think Lawrence Brown, who looked at a lot of maps of issues in the city. So looking at income levels, looking at unemployment, looking at lead paint poisoning, looking at foreclosures, and he found over and over and over again that you could clearly map where where difficulties are that occur in neighborhoods that are predominantly African American. That this white L that runs through the middle of the city and then along the coast or the harbor is exempted from the issues. And he termed this the Black L. And what it really does is it gives a visual to the fact that literally built into Baltimore, into how streets and neighborhoods are arranged, into how funding flows, anti-Black and racist policies have cut off opportunity and resources to some neighborhoods and not others. So this is important to know that Baltimore is a highly segregated town and has been for most of its history, and that's been recodified over and over again in law and private practice. The end.
The chat is open and available, and Becky is kind of keeping her eyes on that. So if you have questions, clarifying questions, and if we don't get to them now, we'll save some time at the end to talk about those. So I know that's a huge lot of information to take in, but context and history is really important when we kind of share stories, especially when you're sharing stories about physical spaces. Now seems like a really great time to take a group screenshot. So if you're interested in so we want to make sure we do it because otherwise we're going to forget. If you're interested in being screenshotted, please turn your video on, make your face real cute or silly. Let me make sure there's nobody hiding in the waiting room. Oh, real quickly, while we're all getting cute and ready, Katie, where did the data come from for the map project? That is from the US Census Bureau in 2013. And at the end of this slideshow, we have a list of links to resources, and there's a link to that in there. Let's see. Oh, great. No, Mark, I can't stop sharing my screen. No, I'm just kidding. Thanks, Mark. Okay, all right. Is anybody better at the screen grab on my team than I am? I got like 16,000 things open.
I can do just everybody, I'm gonna count 1, 2, 3, and we'll all smile. Okay, 1, right. 2, 3.
And do you need to do it twice because there's more than on the screen?
I do, and thank you so much, everybody, for your patience.
Smile again because you don't know where you are.
That's true. All right, let me get to page number 2. And we'll go 1, 2, 3, smile. Great. Thank you, everybody.
All right. So the next thing we'll do, we're going to jump. Let me make sure I word it. Yep. Let me quickly show you the format, and then I'm going to unshare the screen so you can see Becky and Katie sharing their stories. But let me just put this up so you have kind of context in the format that we're sharing. You should be seeing the storytelling slide. Yes, thank you for the affirmative head nod. So when we think about sharing stories, for those of us who do ABCD work, that's one of the greatest ways to collect information on assets, is hearing stories about folks' experiences. And so again, kind of flipping the script on, we're kind of working through stories to unearth challenges to then repackage them into assets. We're still working through that. So Becky and Katie are going to share some stories, and we've kind of worked through, so they've practiced these stories, so you will all have an opportunity to share, and don't feel like you have to have your story as completely put in the framework as it is here, but this helps give you guidance on how do you share this story. And then we talked amongst ourselves about how do we share stories about a time where we unintentionally caused harm, when we had incredibly great intentions in the process. And so when we think about our stories, we think about kind of all the external objective pieces: who was there, what happened, what was the immediate observable impact. You think about going inward, well, what was I thinking or feeling? What was the other person thinking or feeling? And then from there, what restorative action did I learn? Oh, I'm gonna mute somebody here. Okay. Did I learn, did I take, and how did or didn't I take responsibility for the harm caused? And for some of us, our stories might be from a decade ago, and we can't give that person a call, or we're choosing not to give that person a call to say sorry about this. So this may unearth some challenging memories. And again, reminder that you don't share as much as you want, but really try to lean into the discomfort in this moment, and listen to their stories and use that as a model for how you want to share in your small groups. So I'm going to unshare this. Buttons. Stop share. I encourage you to either keep on the grid or click on speaker view, and you can see Katie or Becky, and I'll let you two argue who goes first.
Becky, I just talked. Oh, you want me to go? Okay.
Your audio is doing that garbledy thing again. Talk some more.
Can you hear me now? Is it still garbled? Okay. I will go slowly. So I sit on a committee of about 8 to 10 folks who do fundraising work in the nonprofit sphere in Maryland. And most of the committee members are white, middle-aged ladies. And last fall, we had a meeting, but a social meeting at a local restaurant. And I got into a get to know you conversation with one of the chairs of the committee, who I'm going to call Joy. So to be honest, I don't remember exactly how we got to this topic, but I was sharing about how most of my work in nonprofits is not working with people, it's in the back office. So it's a lot of spreadsheets and databases and admin and operations work. And something that was very cool about this, at that time, newer job that I have, the job I have now with the sports-based youth development, is that I actually see kids in our program every day when they come. The challenge is that such time they know their names. Am I breaking up?
Yeah, so start from, you get to see the kids every day.
Great. I'm gonna turn off my video and hope that helps. So I get to see kids every day, and I know their names from the database, and I know their faces, but I don't know how their names and their faces go together because I don't do work with them. And then I mentioned that it makes it harder because many of our students have a different last name than their parent. And sometimes their sibling in the program has a different last name from either of the two other people in their family. And as I say this to her, my internal alarms start going off. And I think, oh my, what are you doing? You are saying this and you are confirming stereotypes about Black families, about absentee fathers, about having children out of wedlock and how that relates to stereotypes about promiscuity or broken homes. And in this moment, kind of several things are happening. One is that I have a visceral feeling of, oh, all these ideas that I think are associated with the fact that some people in this family have different last names, they're all judgments that I am carrying, right? I didn't invent them. I heard them somewhere. I don't believe them, but they're in me, and they're automatically associated to me. And I also think I have to say something right now to undo this. Like, I have to address the fact that I'm recognizing that what I'm saying could be weaponized. And so I think of like, what do I say? And I end up rattling off a fact that I learned about Icelandic culture, that in Icelandic culture, your last name is your father's name plus son or daughter. So everybody in a family has a different last name from each other. And I say in this conversation with Joy, like, I call myself out and I say, I realized it's really ridiculous for me to try to label a tradition for another community as being challenging just because it doesn't fit into my box of like what's normal to me. So when we all came together to talk about doing this, this session, that's the story that I immediately brought up, because I have really wondered what the impact was. Like, when I shared this information with Joy, was I strengthening a stereotype that maybe she had? And I had to really ask myself, why did I even talk about it? Like, why did I bring this up? And I'll say, like, I know that it was at the time when I was looking through all the permission slips for the year. So I was doing a lot of matching between parents and children. And as I'm realizing that, I also know that trying to defend and explain, like, that wasn't what I meant, is a hallmark of white fragility. Like, that's a thing that white people do all the time when we realize that we've said something that may be hurtful, is try to defend what we were thinking or what were our intentions. And I fact checked myself on it. I actually went back to our database last week and I was looking up, like, well, how many kids do have different last names than their parents? And it's not even that many kids in our program. It's just that it was a few kids whose faces I had learned and that their names went with them that had different last names from their parents or their siblings. So I realized in wanting to tell this story that I really couldn't do it without actually calling Joy to ask her what the impact was. I was making a lot of assumptions about what harm might have been caused, but I had the opportunity to ask her. So I called her up and she did remember the conversation. And she said, yes, she also kind of had immediately jumped to a place of judgment about what having different last names in a family meant. And then we started together kind of interrogating that, questioning that, and coming up with all sorts of examples about different families having different last names. So blended families, families with adopted members, families of choice, families where people might feel forced to or choose to take on like an Americanized name. And then she said, something that I just thought of, she says, is that for a lot of Black people in America, their last name might actually be the name of the person who enslaved their ancestors. And we just sort of sat with that for a minute. So it ended up being a really good conversation where she talked to me about how she had actually grown up in a neighborhood that was majority folks who were Black, that was a low-income neighborhood where the school had broken windows and not enough textbooks, and she's Jewish, and she knew that there were wealthy neighborhoods very close by where her family never went, they didn't feel welcome there. But her family had been able to move to a middle-class neighborhood with a better school, and she had gone on to get a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and eventually, she said, a house with landscaping, right? Like, she'd done very well for herself. And that sometimes she thinks about the kids who were in her classes in first and second grade and wondering how many of them were struggling because their family wasn't able to move to a different neighborhood, and just how incredibly unfair that is. So we were talking about, there's a wonderful book about the history of housing discrimination in Baltimore that I recommended to her. And she recommended some works to me that she'd been reading by women of color who were doing diversity trainings. And we ended up ending the conversation just both very much more thoughtful about the stories that we tell ourselves and tell each other. Was that audible?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And then of course I just cut out. So I'm like, oh no. Thank you, Katie. All right. Were you done? I'm sorry. I cut out right at the end. Okay, good. Oh God. Whew. Thank you everybody for being patient in this virtual world. So kind of before we transition to Becky, Katie, can you do like a really bare bones breakdown? I'll throw the diagram up on the screen again and just really like wham bam, walk us through this.
Yep. So I was there with a person who works in philanthropy, so has connections to people who give money to make programs happen in Baltimore City. And the immediate observable impact on her, I didn't know. I didn't know how she took this information. Internally, I realized that what I was doing was sharing information that could easily be understood to confirm stereotypes that aren't true, and without any kind of context about where those stereotypes came from. The way that I learned what the other person was thinking was that months later now, called her and we had a conversation about it. And what I learned is that I think two things: the history of how discriminatory housing policies have impacted families in Baltimore is very much living history, right? She had an experience of her family experiencing discrimination being Jewish, and that I tried to take responsibility by talking with her to interrogate what our judgments had been and what they might have been based on, and to look at what the actual facts were. I think what I could have done differently is that I didn't need to share that information, right? The point was me talking about how I was learning about students and who they are in their lives. And I picked this idea of names because it was challenging to me, but it wasn't actually a helpful thing. Like it wasn't a helpful piece of information to share. And what I'll do moving forward is to just be really aware that as a white person talking to other white people about my experience working with youth with color, that that I have to be very thoughtful about what I'm sharing, because you don't always have time to kind of give more context, and you don't want to arm somebody with what they believe would be a fact to champion a message or an idea that's incorrect and harmful.
Thank you. All right, for Pete's sake. Am I back? Okay. I'm going to blame it on the wind, is the blame I will cast today. So Becky, I'm going to turn it over to you. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So user's choice, you can put Becky on speaker view or look at everybody's beautiful faces. Take it away.
Okay, so in my story, in June of 2014, I had just finished my first year as the director of the after-school Saturday arts program that I run at the Baltimore School for the Arts. And I received a phone call from a parent. This mom called to thank me for accepting her son into the acting program. Her son was in 6th grade, and she wanted to tell me how excited he was that he had been accepted from the audition process into the acting program, and how happy she was that he would be attending and being able to study acting in our Twigs program at the famed Baltimore School for the Arts, which is one of the top arts high schools in the country. And then she proceeded to tell me that her neighborhood was a violent one, that crime was high in her neighborhood. And she explained that in our community, there was often not enough going on to support kids with giftedness and focus. By the end of this conversation, we were both in tears. And I got off the phone and I was so moved by the phone call. And by how fortunate I was to be in the position that I was. It was a position that I actually hadn't really wanted at first. It was offered to me, I turned it down, and then was asked to take it again after a search that came up empty, and finally decided I would take the position. And after this phone call, I was sort of reinvigorated and inspired. And I was so moved by this phone call and the fact that this woman had said to me that I was creating opportunities for children in Baltimore, that I decided to post about it on Facebook. And the post basically read that a mom called to thank me for Twigs, for this program, and that I was literally saving kids in her community, which, by the way, is exactly what she told me. I went on in my post to say that it wasn't me, it was the Baltimore School for the Arts, and that the school is a place that inspires, and I just get to work there. About 2 hours later, I got a phone call from the foundation director at our school that one of our colleagues saw my post and was on a warpath. He was so angry with me that he wound up in our office, in one of our offices, literally boiling. Now, this colleague is Black. He's a colleague that I had gone to the high school with because we both graduated from the Baltimore School for the Arts together. We had known each other for nearly 30 years. We have worked together. We have spent time outside of school together. And he was angry with me about this post. Now, to be clear, nowhere in this post did I mention skin color, but guess what? I didn't have to. At first, I was so upset. I was like, what did I do wrong here? What have I done wrong? This is about my institution doing good work. This wasn't about me. Now, I am white and my friend is Black, right? And it took some time for me to realize where his anger was coming from. My friend is a Black gay cellist who has had to fight oppression in more ways than I can possibly imagine. And it took me quite some time to realize that what I had done was to sum up a mother's experience and my gratitude about it. And I wrapped it up in a pretty white bow with sunshine and rainbows, and I sprinkled it with a big dose of virtue signaling and a whole lot of, from his perspective, microaggression and an act of white privilege. That's what I had done. I had to go and speak to my friend about what I had done and apologize and explain to him that I literally had absolutely no idea that what I had done would offend him, and that I was absolutely wrong, that I was completely ignorant in posting that I would think long and hard before I would go ahead and post something like that again. And I do. In the world that we're now living in, with the anger that is happening in our communities now, it has taken me a long time to it takes me a long time to post things on social media, which I do. But I read, I reflect, I'm incredibly mindful about what and how I post. I try really hard to see things from other people's perspective. I sometimes reach out to friends and say, should I post this? How does this read? Because I do not want ever for something to look as if it is virtue signaling or to seem like it is white privilege, because clearly I'm white and clearly I'm privileged just by virtue of being white. And it doesn't matter whether or not I mean well from other people's perspectives, it doesn't necessarily look that way.
Thank you. I'm gonna put the little breakdown on the screen. So Becky, I'm gonna challenge you to give us the 1-minute recap using the framework.
Okay, so I was there on the phone with a parent. I decided to post about something that I thought was inspiring. A friend of mine was incredibly offended by that post. I was confused and upset by his reaction to that post. He, from his perspective, felt like it was white privilege and virtue signaling. I needed to take time to understand my feelings, his perspective, and I had to really sort of peel back those layers and try to understand his perspective, where he was coming from, and then from there do a lot of reflection, as well as be mindful about how to move forward, to make sure that I was being thoughtful about how to listen more carefully, be more sensitive to my friends of color, people of color in our community, and think maybe beyond my own perspective before posting or opening my mouth in the future.
Thank you. All right, stop share. Okay, so we have reached a point where we want to transition into you all having opportunity to share with one another. Oh, thanks, Amanda. Bye. And I want to give folks opportunity if we're going to take a little bit of a break because I got to do the back end of putting you into breakout rooms. And I'm going to do it manually so I can make sure that not everyone from the same region is together. Part of the goal of the unconference is to meet people from all over the world. So I'm going to do a little work around with that. But I also want to give folks the opportunity if you're feeling like, nope, this is not the time for me to be sharing my story. I don't want to engage in this way. You are more than welcome to kind of bow out in this moment. And I ask you do that in the next minute or so. So when we start splitting out the breakout rooms, we're really honoring who's actually going to be here and participating, because we're going to split you into groups of 3 to 5, depending on how many people are still here. So goodbye. I see there's lots of folks heading out. So thanks, Mark. Thanks, Deborah.
I think also once folks who have to leave are leaving, while we're sorting everybody, this might be a great time to do that bio break. So that when you come back to your rooms, or should we wait on that?
No, go do your biology. Go get your water, go get your snack, jump around. I encourage you, if you have the luxury of not checking your email or jumping back into other stuff, if you want to kind of keep in this space, I encourage you just to maybe walk around in a circle, close your eyes, try to kind of stay in this space. And I'll shut my mouth so I can try to do this breakout rooms. So the next time you engage, it will be with a smaller group of people. Oh, no, I'm a big old liar. Hold on, I gotta share something in the chat. So what I'm sharing in the chat is that framework, not to Katie, everyone. Okay, here we go. Here's a Google Doc. You can look at it. So either screenshot or copy paste that. This next session with your small group is really about just sharing stories and getting to know one another. So take a minute to introduce yourselves and work through this framework. And then we'll come back together as a large group, and then we'll split back out into bigger groups and kind of workshop through a couple of stories. So this is really just a chance to share stories, small group, engage, and then we'll come back as a large group and regroup and go from there. Oh boy. Fiona is off to the Haiti session. All right. This is incredible. Okay, now I'll be quiet and move you around. And once you're in your small groups, start sharing your stories. And we'll have, we'll take 10 minutes in those small groups. So you'll loop back around here between 12:10 and 12:15. And the beauty of the Zoom is it'll force you to come back. This is my favorite part, when everybody flies back. Oh, Kim, you're outside.
I'm outside. I know I've been inside on like 9 hours of Zoom yesterday. I was just like, I'm not responsible for the Zoom. I'm going outside.
Good on you. Okay, and I think it gives people 1 minute to come back to the space. We can keep doing, let's see. Allison L in Wisconsin, I don't think I gave you a shout out. Hi. I'll do that again. I don't know if it amuses anyone or like drives people nuts. All right, let me check if anyone's still hiding in their rooms. Did we all come back? We have decreased. 4, 16. Okay. So what we're gonna do, because our group kind of thinned out, and there's some folks on here who are not super engaged, which is fine. I hope that means they're listening intently. We thought instead of breaking into kind of a bigger group, we're just gonna stay in this size group and give folks opportunity to share out. And again, this is a space where chat is welcome. Oh, and I wanted to answer, Chris had a question. Oops, I lost it. For the framework, who should that be credited to? I feel like this was a collective action between the three of us. And Katie, I think you started it. Was there anyone specifically you want to credit this framework to?
I could not have invented it myself. I think it's just a gathering of information from a lot of places. So thanks, the world. Yeah.
So look, we curated our knowledge from kind of storytelling and restorative practices. And this is actually a really good framework, a side note for when working with young people in conflict resolution. So kind of breaking out the pieces of that. So it kind of, we've all experienced this in different capacities. So I want to open the floor up to anyone to share. Does anyone want to share their story or kind of their experience of working through this framework and sharing story?
I mean, I could share something.
Everyone.
If I'm, yeah, I got my mute on. I found it hard to find an issue where race played a role because I've grown up in a segregated space. I mean, my family has always lived in suburbs that are out of the reach of probably most white people even, high income areas, not because of my work, but my father's work. And so I didn't have encounters with people that were racially diverse, but I do remember in Nova Scotia, there was a group of school children who were from like a fishing village, and we would tease amongst ourselves, make fun of those children as being inbred and things like that. And it's an experience in my life that I've carried into my adulthood, and had playfully referred to people as, oh yes, I went to a school where there was a group of children who came, and sociologists from all over the world would come to study them. You know, just kind of making fun on a class-based thing. And I think this whole awareness of the racial disparities in America and around the world has made me think more about the systemic problems, you know, the capitalism in particular, that it just seems like when I see people, BLM and these protests, that I think, are we really going to get to the root of the problem, or are we just going to have a change of linens? Because it seems like so much of these injustices are rooted in capitalism. And so, I mean, I really I yearn for a deeper understanding of the issues, because I know that it is a spiritual transformation that occurs when we get to the root of these things. spiritual being primarily, I think of spirituality as being fundamentally social, that it doesn't exist outside of a social space. So it's important work, but I wonder if it's just addressing a part of the problem. And maybe that's a little inappropriate, but that's where I'm coming from. I don't know. The end.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And Richard, I have to share, my parents are right up the street from you in Salina, so I'm very familiar with good old Wichita. Yeah, and so that's an interesting thing to name. It's like, it's hard when you have, I grew up in a white suburb in Western Massachusetts before my family moved out to Kansas, and we had a Black cleaning woman. That was my first introduction to race, who I loved dearly. Mrs. Foster was a part of our family, and I have a very distinct memory of her being the only Black person in my life, except for the time she brought her grandchildren over. But I remember asking her why the bottom of her palms were not the same color as the top of her hand. And then for a good decade, I didn't know any other Black people. So it's an interesting when you don't operate in space, and Katie, Becky, and I are coming to this conversation, working in space, living and working in space where we are sometimes the minority in the rooms that we're in, when having to be reminded constantly that we are still operating in the white supremacist capitalist systemic models. So thank you, Richard, for bringing up the capitalism piece to this. And that could be 16 other conferences and kind of unpacking and unrooting a lot of that. So thank you for your share, and thank you for bringing those pieces up. Is anyone else feeling compelled to kind of share out? I'm curious, folks who are not US based, who chose to stick around with us through this whole conversation, if anyone wants to share out. No pressure, but we do want to hear different perspectives.
I think, so I live in Quebec right now, but I'm from Nova Scotia. And I think recently the Black Lives Matters movement and how much media has been out there has made me reflect a lot about also how I grew up and who I was surrounded by. And I come from a fairly rural area in Nova Scotia. And I was like, I lived on one side of town, and most of that side of town was white people. And then on the other side of town was not the whole other side of town, but in a certain area was more of a predominantly Black neighborhood. And we have our town, I mean, our country for sure, just like the US has a long history of racism, and our town particularly. And so there was no mixture, like, until we were probably in junior high, so we would go to different elementary schools, and then in junior high, those schools would come together. And it wasn't that we couldn't mix, it was just, if you lived on that side of town, you went to a certain school. And then with the Indigenous community, there was a reserve probably about, 15 or 20 minutes away. So again, we didn't mix with those individuals a lot of time till high school, until those schools came together. So kind of reflecting back, like, that's how you were brought up without even knowing, and what does that create in terms of your outlook on life? And those communities seem to be more in poverty. Those schools, when you heard about those schools, you heard about the issues within those schools. So that's kind of how I think my worldview in some ways was shaped, even if I didn't know it. And it's kind of taking me time as an adult to figure out how is that still shaping my biases, and how is that still shaping the way I see people and the assumptions I make of people. Even having really important people in my life who are Black, like, I still carry this. My boyfriend's Black, and I still carry these biases. So I guess it's making me think, like, how much of this we do carry into adulthood, and how much unlearning, like, we continuously have to do.
Thank you. It's a practice. It's not a perfection. This isn't done overnight. And I think, and I appreciate you naming kind of the Indigenous community. And so I think right now we're speaking specifically anti-racism. We're talking a lot with a lens of race, but reminding ourselves even the different groups that we don't engage with in space, indigenous communities, communities that have been harmed through kind of all the systemic processes that have kept us separated. And this does carry over into adulthood, and it carries over through generations. And so how do you kind of take the time to name and unpack and know that it's not just like, oh, I've taken a workshop and I'm done now. It's like, what are we still doing to kind of keep doing that? So thank you again for sharing that perspective. Any other folks? I see Kenya and South Africa, and you do not have to share if you do not want to, but I'm grateful you're in the space with us, and I'm curious if either of you are interested in sharing a little bit of your own stories or kind of reflections or takeaways from this conversation.
Janine from Joburg. An interesting thing for me is that my background, I grew up in many multiracial settings, even though at the time they were not kind of officially legal. I was born on a mission station amongst African people. I then went to, my father was a priest as well, and he was training people to become ministers of the church. So we lived on a seminary campus that was multiracial until the then government decided to close us down and kick us off the land. And because of that kind of upbringing, my parents sent me to an international school in Swaziland, where I was at school with Mandela's daughters, and it was like living the new South Africa before it kind of happened. And the funny thing is that growing up, I actually had more issues with Afrikaans-speaking white people. I was probably fairly racist against them because they were seen as the enemy within South Africa. My father's church was working predominantly in black areas, and he ended up going into prison for 9 months because he was seen as being fighting against the apartheid system. So he was detained for 9 months. My brother was in prison for a month and a half and ended up fleeing the country and growing up in Switzerland. And the funny thing is, coming back to live in South Africa as a white person, my issue was against other white people who were a different language group to me, because they were the enemy. They were the police. They were the guys that came and took my dad from the house in the middle of the night. They were the people that used to follow me when I was at university. I had an Indian boyfriend. And, you know, so it's funny how in South Africa, we sort of see white people and black people. But within each of those groupings, when I've spoken to some of the youngsters now in South Africa, young black women, young black people, my life story, they often think they didn't sort of realize that within the white grouping, there are Afrikaans speaking, there are English speaking, there are people who came from Portugal, people who came from Scotland. There's, you know, a whole lot of different groupings, and we tend to just kind of lump everybody in one thing, whereas within those color groupings, there are people that are often quite different, and it's not easy to mingle across language barriers. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. It's a good reminder to thinking beyond the binary, the black, the white, the red, the green, whatever binary it is, everything's on the spectrum, and within that there's different contexts and different stories. So ensuring we're thinking beyond that. Anyone else from anywhere want to share?
I can share. Hi, Martina. I live in DC, but I'm originally Argentinian. I moved to the US when I was about 17, I'm 24 now, so that's not that long ago. And I remember, you know, Argentina is a fairly racially homogeneous country, and we're not taught the concept of race, right? We don't talk about people as like having race, which isn't, you know, there's a lot of issues with that. But the point is, when I got here, I thought, you know, I started learning about racism and the racial tension history in the US. And I thought, well, I am not a racist because I wasn't taught race. And so I wasn't taught racism, right? Because I don't have all these, like, my parents didn't teach me bad things about other races because we didn't learn race, right? And so I thought I was kind of like above all that, by virtue of never having thought about it, right? And then I thought, well, I'm also Hispanic, so I can be racist because I'm brown, right? And that was just the whole issue of colorism and all the things that I learned along the way. But so my journey in the US has been very intense and enlightening in many ways, because the first thing that I had to learn was that being colorblind is not a way of being anti-racist. Is on the contrary, like it's a harmful perspective, right, or way to approach this. And again, because I was first introduced to all these concepts for the first time in my life at 17 years old, it's hard, to change the older you are, and then more, and there's pride, and you get defensive when you get called a racist and you don't think you're a big one, and you don't really understand what racism is, so you don't know how you're participating in it, and then how you can like fight against it. So I ended up doing sociology. I have a master's in sociology. I started, I'm trying to take it very seriously and like educating myself as a practice, like you said, not a profession. But I want to share that it's I don't know exactly what I was trying to share, but I think that it's incredible that there are events like this where people keep, even though they were taught this system and they've had all these concepts in their lives for their whole lives, there's just never a final, well, no, I'm anti-racist. It's something that has to be constant. And so that's what I want to share.
Thank you. Yeah, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you come up through systems, so the education system is kind of inherently, in the United States in particular, and it sounds like from your experience, when you're just not educated on any of this stuff from the jump, and you reach adulthood and you're kind of shocked by like, wait a minute, what? This is a thing? So that is certainly, yeah, thank you for naming you don't know what you don't know. And the phrase, I wasn't taught race, so how could I be a racist, it's just such an interesting thing to unpack. And so thank you for sharing that and naming that. And Janine, can you clarify your statement? Are you saying that we're assuming white identifying folks in this space? I want to clarify the comment.
Yes, I was also, I was just interested to see that all the people who've joined this group are from I guess, white backgrounds. I wasn't sure whether we were going to have like a lot of people joining us who are Black people who would want to come in and be part of this conversation. It was interesting for me that there aren't any Black people represented in this group.
So I want to thank you for naming that, and I want to also name that's an assumption based on the tiles that we have.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know, and we didn't do this. We didn't go around and name what our identities were. So Martina, you just named that you're Hispanic, and so I don't want to pin on you right now, but you don't have to answer this, but we did not give you a space to identify whether or not you were white. And so I think that's an important point. And this is not an argument, but this is one of the challenges of this, especially now in this landscape of a virtual setting. I have several Black identifying friends who you would not see as Black on the screen. And we also understand anti-racism work is not always the responsibility of communities of color, in particular Black folks. And so I'm honestly not surprised that no Black folks are in this space, because right now we need to be doing the work. Non-Black identifying folks in particular, if we're talking about that binary specifically of Black and anti-Black. And so I'm grateful that you brought that up, because that's something to always keep in mind, is we don't know each other that well, other than these little squares and the conversations that we've had. Katie, Becky, and I did tell you that we are white identifying, and we made an assumption that the majority of folks who are going to come into this space are also white identifying. And we also made sure to name we are white identifying as kind of an announcement that for this is going to be a conversation from that lens. And I think, I don't know if I was a Black identifying person, this is a space I'd want to be in, because we need to work this out amongst ourselves in that kind of way. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. This is kind of a new thing that we're all kind of experiencing right now. Oh, Lisa, do you have something you'd like to add to that?
Sure. This is actually a really nice like handover to the discussion we had before. I wasn't very sure whether or not that was like the space and time to bring that up. But so I'm European, but I have lived in Kenya for the last 11 years, which comes with a lot of interesting implications. And I'm very happy for anyone who is interested in speaking about this more. What I was actually sharing about in our breakout group, and then it just suddenly disappeared. We could not really wrap it up. What I was speaking about was exactly about this idea of like, it's up to us to figure this out. It is up to us to do something about white supremacy. It's not up to the people who are being oppressed to do something about it. And so what I was speaking about earlier, like I was sharing a story as well, but I think we don't necessarily have the time to share that story. But the bottom line for me is that I have been anti-racist for a very, very long time, ever since I was really young, way before I knew that that term existed. And the problem that I have always faced is that when people come to me with stories, and it happens here and it happened before, it happens a lot here, like white privilege is a real deal in African settings as well. Especially, I assume, in settings where there are many white people. We are incredibly privileged, even in a space like here. But like my main point somehow is that I am really thinking about how we can be better allies and do that in a way that is inclusive. Because my personal issue definitely is that when someone comes to me with like very biased, very racist, very privileged statements, I get so upset that I snap. And snapping at people does not necessarily help. It's like, so you think you're so much better than us. No. And then you have that whole additional layer. And it's like, dude, like focus on the issue. And like, let me just like very briefly go back to my story that I was sharing. So I was with a group of 3 of my girlfriends from high school when I was just out of high school in my first year of uni. We went to Tunisia, went to one of those really nice like beaches, hotels, and we had all been working so hard in our first year of uni. We were so happy. And we were lying on the beach, like, you know, tanning, being really happy. We only had 1 week before we had to go back to whatever like busy hustle we were engaging in. And we're there in our bikinis, really enjoying the sun. And then a group of local women and their kids came, and they were bathing with hijabs, like for swimming, and they had long t-shirts over their bathing suits, and they were having the time of their life. Now, one of my girlfriends looked at them, she's like, oh my God, look at those women. They're so oppressed. They're not even allowed to go swimming. And I turn around, I look at her and I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? Sorry. I was like, are you serious? You don't see how much fun those women have? You think that lying around or flashing your boobs in the sunlight for everybody to see is the epitome of freedom? And she was revolted. She wouldn't speak to me for like 2 days because she felt so offended because she didn't mean it. And I believe her that she didn't mean it. She didn't understand. She was speaking from a position where she was assuming that her values were universal and that freedom meant flashing your boobs to everybody. She had absolutely no conception of the fact that those women were perfectly happy and that was perfectly fine and that it was not her place, where she was already a guest, to start having judgments. But I did not find a way of expressing that in a way that was inclusive. And I'm really still struggling with that. I'm still struggling with that always. When people come, especially when they come with extremely stupid comments, I get so blasé, man. I am just so upset that it's very difficult for me to just like sit there and be like, so this is what you think. So why would you think that? Like, I have no patience. But it's exactly that issue, like in the whole issue that we are discussing in the context of the current events in the world as well, right? Like when you react in a way that is strong in emotion and you react in a way that is strong in language, very often you don't actually manage to get people on board. Yes, is it important to express that it's revolting when someone says something like that? I do believe so. I do. At the same time, the ultimate objective for us, I assume, is to get people on board. So how to bridge that gap is like really one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot, and that's what I was sharing. And I'd be very happy for our conversation in general to turn more towards that, because I do believe that's very important for everybody to recognize their own privilege and to recognize where in their past or even in the present, they might still be engaging in behaviors that are complacent at best and complicit at worst, if you will. But what we can actually do, without being patronizing, because obviously also in a space like here, like when, as a white person in Kenya, people always assume I do voluntary work. And I'm like, no, dude, like I don't believe in charity. And there's nothing wrong with charity in your own space. I am an outsider in this space here. It is not my role. It is not my role to be charitable. I don't believe in that. So like, yeah, just to get to like a conversation where you can speak to the people to whom you might have access because you look alike and because you share similar backgrounds, without pushing them away too hard, but without having like velvet gloves either. Like, why would you? If someone walks around this world having so much privilege, why do I have to like touch them in velvet gloves? I'm not sure. But yeah, so that is the thing I'm thinking about. I'm really grateful about the session, by the way. It's fantastic.
Thank you. When I wrote down what you said and then I lost it. Oh, the charity piece, charity in your own space. So this is another conference we could have weeks over, is just the amount of harm that the culture of charity work has done in your own backyard, in different countries. I speak from a perspective as a returned Peace Corps volunteer who did 2 years in Senegal, West Africa, in a rural community. And that's kind of, that's a whole nother can of worms, but a lot of that was kind of, I've been unpacking that experience for 10, 12 years now. And how that translates to my work in communities of color in Baltimore City. I want to be cognizant of time. I'm seeing there's some great comments going in the chat. If you kind of want to have something that you want to spout out, we'd love to hear some kind of takeaways. What are like next steps folks want to take? I do, and while folks are kind of sharing that, I'm going to share screen again, and we're going to share kind of 2 kind of tangible practices to take forward. And Lisa, one thing I also wanted to mention or name, when people say things that are just so outrageous to you, and that your story is such a beautiful illustration of everyone's lived experience is their lived experience. So those women on the beach just having like a freaking blast, like with their children, and who are you to shit on their fun time with your tits hanging out? Like, I think that, and I'm being really graphic because I think that's such an important way to illustrate the story. And I also think approaching it with curiosity, like, well, why do you think that that's not great? And I know that it's so hard to kind of do the internal work to be like, oh, I just want to punch you in the face right now, but trying to approach it with the curiosity. And if it's especially, I think this is the most challenging with people you care about and with people you have relationship with. And I have conservative white parents who are baby boomers, and the amount of like gripping, but approaching it with care and curiosity. And it's so much easier said than done. But how do we do that with kind of the lens that like, we have to move the needle on this, we have to push this forward. And that kind of leads us to kind of, let me share this guy. I'm also super stoked I got to insert a Dilbert cartoon into this space. I can't help make jokes. So one thing I want folks to really digest from this conversation is like, forget about goals. This is all about systems learning. And so what the heck does that even mean? So we talk about the word systemic racism. We talk about systemic challenges, all about systems learning. And we're trying, so a goal is, I gotta get my notes so I tell you the right thing. Goals are about the results you want to achieve, and systems are about the processes that lead to those results. So if we kind of break down Lisa's story, you know, the goal was we wanted your friend to not be a racist in that moment against folks of, we assume, from Muslim background. But you didn't have a system to navigate that conversation in that moment. So how are we building up these systems? And we want to do that system building because winners and losers have the same goal. So two folks have the same goal of dismantling systemic racism on the beach. But if I don't have a good system to navigate that conversation, I'm not going to get anywhere. Achieving a goal is only a momentary change. So if you think about if you've gone on a diet or know anybody that's gone on a diet or did an exercise program, and a lot of this, and I kind of do a lot of drawing parallels between an exercise practice and an anti-racist practice. And I'm somebody who's been practicing Ashtanga yoga for about 5 years. Whole nother conversation, but showing up every day and doing the same thing over and over again is this kind of system building. And it's not about getting my handstand, it's about working my body every single day. Goals restrict your happiness. So you kind of get into that failure loop of like, I haven't done it, I haven't done it. Joy and happiness are really important parts of the revolution. I want you to think long and hard about that. And goals are at odds with long-term progress. Again, it says short-term wins, it's not gonna make it. It's about long-term, slow, systemic change. And then really quickly, I know we're really running up on time. Katie, can you just, in like 6 seconds, share what the heck this thing is for folks?
Absolutely. So this is a model about how people experience behavioral change that came out of some researchers, one of whom actually is based in Baltimore. It came from the 1970s of looking at people who had successfully quit smoking versus folks who hadn't, and trying to identify, well, what were the differences between these groups? And what they found is that when people are approaching a behavioral change, right, whether it's to lose weight or stop doing something or start doing something, they predictably move through this cycle over and over again. It's not a one and done, it's a continuous spiral. You start with pre-contemplation where you're not even thinking about making a change yet, right? Like you aren't even open to it. In contemplation, you think, oh, I guess I could, right? I could maybe do this differently, or I'm starting to explore the idea of what my life would be like if I put this new thing into practice. In preparation, you've made the decision like, okay, I am going to make this change. Now I start amassing the skills or the resources or the supports or the knowledge to actually do that. In action, you start, acting, actually doing the thing. And then hopefully you're into maintenance. And then often at some point there's a relapse, right? Your practice breaks down, for whatever reason. I think in things like addiction, it's very clearly to know what relapse is, but it could also be that you find yourself reverting to old ways of thinking or being. And then often if you've relapsed and you feel like, oh, I fell off the wagon, sometimes you abandon the idea like, oh, I tried to do this and I couldn't do it, so now I'm back to the old way forever. And sometimes that kicks you back into pre-contemplation where you're not even thinking about trying to get back on the horse, to mix up some metaphors here. But I think this is really helpful to think about when we're in conversation with especially with other white people, and trying to Lisa, to your point, I think trying to understand where is this person in their understanding of like the history and impact of racism where we are, right? Are they actively denying that anything is happening? They're in pre-contemplation. They're not even open to the idea. Are they starting to ask you questions, but they haven't changed their behavior, but maybe they're asking, well, how do you deal with this? Or what's the way of doing that? Then they're in preparation. And the big point is that you can't push someone further along this cycle. People move themselves along the cycle. What you can do is recognize what stage someone is in and support what they need to do in that stage so that they become ready to move to the next stage. Does that make sense?
Can I respond to that? So like I work a lot in ABCD stuff. So it does make a lot of sense. It does, period. But then again, like for example, like in my context with my friend now on the beach, I felt like, and I assume that to be true, that so many people live such comfortable lives being entitled that they're not necessarily compelled to ever getting out of their pre-contemplation stage. So the position I find myself in, and I think that that is also what I subconsciously decided in that situation, was that, you know what, like I value less how you see me in this situation. I value more that I believe you think about stuff that is worthy of being thought about. And that is why I snapped. And later, 2 days later, I told her, you know what, like I'm sorry I snapped at you, but I really think that it's important you think about the kind of stuff you have been talking about. So like the position I sometimes take is that I'd rather take a backseat in my personal relationship with someone, because I think that the fact that I'm creating disruption is helping them to somehow, like, you know, take a leap, to at least start considering that perhaps that is something they have to think about. Because the truth is, people who are entitled have absolutely no incentive to thinking differently. Why would they? They're entitled. They're well.
Sure.
They're the ones who are winning, right?
Mm-hmm. And so I think, in like, to put these two ideas together, that you by confronting can help someone move from pre-contemplation to contemplation, but it's not possible to move someone from pre-contemplation all the way to action immediately, right? It's like, I can help you get one step further. Yeah,
definitely. And I think the framework actually helps to think about that. But I just noticed that, like, for me, it's so difficult sometimes, because I wished I could get to a contemplation phase without having to endure the emotional stress of having to push someone. Because I hate offending my friends. Like, I love them. Like, I have no reason for offending them, but I think they're stupid sometimes. So I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. Like this tension where you just feel like, oh, do I actually have to take this route and be the one who's making you uncomfortable, and thereby being uncomfortable for you to actually start thinking about something that you have no incentive of thinking about because life is good.
And that's the hard shit. I want to move us, because we have 3 minutes and I know there's other sessions folks are wanting to attend. I want to transition us out of this space. So again, if you've been with us since the jump, thank you for sticking it out till the end. We're going to start the way we're going to end the way we started. So finding a little bit of ground, take a minute, find your butt, your feet, however you want to find some ground, find some symmetry in your body. Take a breath, take a minute. And I want to share this quote I caught this morning. I was feeding my munchkin her breakfast, who I think a lot about when I do this work. I think about future generations. I think about all the small people in my life, the small people that will inevitably come to be. And we don't plant the seeds so that we can eat the fruit. We plant the seeds, we tend to the land, we cultivate the land, we care for the trees to nourish future generations. So think really long and deeply about kind of the work that you're doing now, the work that you continue to do, and kind of all the stuff we're going to slog through. Because there's future generations. Whether or not they're yours, they're coming. And we have no excuse to fuck this up for all of them. So with that, I'm gonna then transition us to, listen, this is kind of a nasty way to transition you all, but this shit's real, and it's hard. Here, Katie's in my email. If you wanna stay connected, I do work like this for pay if you work for an organization that's interested in kind of that route. I'm also just here for a conversation, so feel free to connect with us. I'm gonna also send right here, I'm gonna throw in the chat real quick. Yes, we have a resources, so I'm gonna go away thing. I'm gonna stop sharing that. I'm gonna open Becky shared her email in the chat. Here's a link to a document with kind of all the resources we referred to in the PowerPoint. I believe all these are being uploaded to some magical space that you'll have access to later, but if you stuck it out this long, you're gonna get free preview. I'm gonna copy paste the chat. If there are any lingering Were there any lingering questions, Becky, that we didn't get to? Because I know you were watching the chat. Cool.
No, I think we're pretty good. I think I've responded to everyone. Did I not respond? Did anyone have anything that they felt like needed to be addressed that I didn't quite respond to?
Cool.
Okay.
And I think we have to release the room. So with that, oops, just in case, we don't need that. All right, I think we're good. Thank you all. I appreciate you all. Those who I don't get to see very often, it was really nice to see your little tiny faces on my screens. I'm grateful to hold space with you, and please be well, take care of one another, take care of the future generations, and we'll see you soon.